Vera is caught up in the midst of a lively and rowdy crowd, waving flags, drinking from bottles, and standing on each other's shoulders, creating a chaotic atmosphere. She appears to be physically present but emotionally distant from the people around her, and there seems to be a communication barrier hindering her ability to engage with others effectively. She feels like she's fighting her way through a sea of people, with the sound of the crowd ebbing and flowing around her, until a sudden burst of noise startles her. She is surprised to see a motorcar filled with partygoers, including a woman drinking champagne on top, and a young soldier with a bandaged head jumps out upon spotting Vera. He grabs her hand and pulls her out of the spinning ride, helping her regain her balance and composure. Vera takes a deep breath and thanks him, feeling grateful for his help. She finally reaches the top of the steps, panting and relieved to have found a moment of respite from the chaos of the crowd. Vera enters the church and looks around, taking in the grandeur of the interior. She feels a sense of peace wash over her. Vera is struck by the sight of Francis Danby's The Deluge, a rich oil painting that looms before her as she walks down a side aisle. The painting depicts a catastrophic flood that seems to capture Vera's attention and imagination. Vera initially appears to be struggling but then seems to surrender to the water and begins to float effortlessly. Just as she starts sinking again, she summons the strength for one final push and successfully emerges from the water's surface. Vera surfaces in an outstanding lake, her body feeling weightless and free as she takes in the beauty of her surroundings. It's been 5 years, she has a youthful and radiant appearance, unburdened by the hardships and challenges that had left their mark on her. Vera is secretly observing her brother and his friend as they undress by the lakeside. Edward's reserved and artistic nature versus Victor's gentle disposition. She remains hidden behind the greenery, swimming silently and unnoticed. Edward is worried about Vera's safety and hopes she hasn't arrived in the area yet, but he also confesses that he forgot about the rats and warns Victor about a large nest nearby. Edward acknowledges Victor's fear of rats but assures him that they will not be a problem in the shallows. However, he advises against going to the area where the rats are situated as a precautionary measure to avoid any potential danger or discomfort. Edward's initial gesture towards the water is one of admiration for Vera's enjoyment, but it quickly turns to worry as he tells her to watch out for the rats. Victor himself is worried about Vera's safety and tries to warn her, but Vera appears to be oblivious to the danger and invites them to join her in the water. Victor runs down the pier to reach Vera and dives into the water to swim towards her. As he surfaces, he notices her smile but is surprised to see Edward grinning at him and jumping into the water. They laugh and enjoy the refreshing water, while Vera watches them joyfully. A little later, at the edge of the lake, Vera is being assisted by Edward in getting dressed behind a towel, while Victor is seen in the distance hastily putting on his pants. Edward is trying to get Vera to open up about her relationship with Victor, but Vera noncommittally redirects the conversation back to Edward. Despite this, Edward persists in his questioning and tries to encourage Vera to share more details. Vera responds by describing Victor as sweet, but Edward disapproves of her response, believing that her increased attention has made her arrogant. Victor expresses that he feels frozen. Vera hands the towel to him with a warm and welcoming gesture. He takes it with a smile and begins to dry off. Edward finishes getting dressed and checks his watch, indicating that it's time to leave. Vera expresses her reluctance to depart. He reminds Vera that their parents are waiting for them, but Vera jokingly expresses her annoyance with their constant expectations and how it can be overwhelming at times. Vera savors the tranquility of the natural surroundings before rejoining her companions in the woods, feeling refreshed and rejuvenated. They enjoy the scenic route as they make their way back home. They approach the front garden of Melrose, a grand Victorian building painted in a gray hue. As they walk, Vera suddenly remembers her wet hair and rushes to tuck it up and out of sight. Then, Vera notices a delivery van parked outside with Summerson's pianos emblazoned on the side. She stops in her tracks, feeling dismayed, and looks to Edward for an explanation. Edward appears guilty as they quickly make their way up the garden path, with Vera taking the lead and Edward and Victor following closely behind. Vera's anger towards Edward is fueled by her belief that he acted behind her back, and although he admits to knowing about their father's wish for Vera to have a piano, he denies any involvement in the delivery. Despite his explanation, Vera remains furious and storms off into the house. As Vera makes her way along the hallway towards the living room, she hears the sounds of a heavy object being moved and the clang of piano keys. Upon entering the living room, she sees delivery men carefully maneuvering a grand piano into place, with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Brittain, a family friend, Mrs. Ellinger, and her teenage daughter overseeing the delivery. Mr. Brittain, a self-made businessman, is known for being outgoing and kind but also prone to sudden outbursts of temper and bouts of depression. Mrs. Brittain, a woman who was once less traditional than her husband, now appears fragile on the surface, but retains complete control over domestic affairs. As Mr. Brittain spots Vera, he calls out to her to see the surprise. Mrs. Brittain approaches and takes her daughter's arm, confessing that she has been eagerly waiting to reveal the surprise. Mrs. Ellinger, who had been in on the secret, expresses her desire to hear Vera play. Upon her return, Vera's face displays a tense and gloomy expression. Mr. Brittain admires the grand piano, acknowledging its stunning beauty and urging Vera to showcase her skills. Meanwhile, the delivery men complete their work and depart from the house. Mrs. Brittain takes a seat next to the poised Mrs. Ellinger and her daughter, with Victor joining them as well. The room falls into an expectant silence. Edward casts a sympathetic glance towards Vera, understanding her emotional state. Vera then walks towards the grand piano and stares at the keys for a brief moment, her hands raised in the air. Suddenly, she brings them down with a loud crash, producing a chaotic and jarring sound. The room falls into stark silence, and Mrs. Brittain and Mrs. Ellinger appear visibly shocked. Vera promptly stands up and rushes towards the door, with her father following closely behind. A tone of authority laced his voice as he demanded an immediate apology from his daughter. In response, Vera's expression takes on a defiant edge, giving no indication of backing down. While Mrs. Brittain and the other guests hover apprehensively in the background, Mr. Brittain reiterates the importance of showing respect to both himself and their visitors. The air becomes thick with tension as they stand in close proximity, with Vera's pent-up emotions threatening to overflow. Her frustration boils over, and she voices her opposition to the piano, insisting that her parents knew she didn't want one but bought it anyway. Mr. Brittain, in disbelief, turns to his wife, and they exchange a few words before Mrs. Brittain offers an explanation, assuring Vera that her father's intentions were good. Nevertheless, Vera is unconvinced, and her anger intensifies as she reveals that the cost of the piano could have covered a year's tuition at Oxford. Mr. Brittain defends his decision to spend money responsibly, provoking Vera's rage even further. Without a word, she storms off upstairs, leaving her father to glance helplessly at his wife, who offers a disapproving look. Mr. Brittain insists, calling out for Vera to return and apologizing for his actions. Mrs. Brittain expresses regret to their guests, aware of the awkwardness of the situation. Vera, still fuming from her encounter with her father, paces back and forth in her room, searching for a way to release her anger and disappointment. She spots a stack of papers and books on her desk, covered in her messy handwriting. Without a second thought, she picks them up and marches over to the nearby window, flinging the pile out in a fit of discontent. Edward and Victor hear a loud thud coming from upstairs, causing them to pause and turn their heads towards the open doorway behind them. Through the doorway, they see a shower of papers fluttering to the ground. Mr. Brittain lets out an annoyed sigh as Vera hurls down the stairs. She announces that she has thrown out her work and doesn't care if it's turned into pulp. Mr. Brittain expresses his concern that she's becoming too focused on intellectual pursuits and won't find a husband. Vera adamantly declares that she doesn't want a husband and apologizes for not fulfilling her father's expectations. She emphasizes that she has no intention of getting married, ever. Victor looks saddened by her words. Roland's arrival creates a sudden interruption in the tense atmosphere. He stands there, holding his luggage, and his physique exudes a sense of confidence and sensuality that goes beyond his 19 years. Everyone is taken aback by his presence, and after a moment of silence, he smiles slightly, as if to acknowledge the tension in the air. Edward and Victor approach Roland and shake hands with him. Vera searches for her discarded books and papers in the dark shrubs outside, while Roland approaches her gently. He offers to help, but Vera declines, stating that she'd rather be alone. Despite this, Roland continues to search for the books and jokes about the way Vera treated them, saying he's never seen anyone beat up books like that before. As Roland searches through the shrubbery, he comes across some damaged books and a handwritten poem on a piece of paper. He decides to pocket the poem. After examining the books for damage, Vera snatches them from him and starts leafing through the pages, seemingly looking for something. Roland comments on the books, mentioning Wordsworth, Shelley, and poor Byron, and suggests that all these romantics aren't good for her. Vera and Roland have a tense conversation outside. Roland's self-assurance annoys Vera, but there is also a spark of attraction between them. Roland apologizes for his poorly timed arrival, but Vera defensively asks why she should care. As she heads back inside, she accuses Roland of finding the situation amusing and turning it into an anecdote for his friends, which Roland denies. Roland watches as Vera heads back inside. He takes a moment to reflect on the encounter and feels a sense of empathy towards her. He then pulls out the piece of paper he found earlier, a handwritten poem, and begins to read it. As he reads, his expression softens, and he appears to be moved by the words on the page. Edward sits at the piano in a dimly lit room as a maid lights an oil lamp. His fingers move gracefully along the keys, playing a gentle melody. Suddenly, he hears a sound and looks up to see Vera standing there watching him. Vera approaches and sits next to Edward at the piano, appearing contrite. She admits that she was too focused on herself to consider what it must mean to him. Edward comments on the mistreatment Vera inflicted on the piano, to which she responds by reminding him of the piano she gave him. Edward then asks about Vera's attachment to Oxford, and she expresses her dissatisfaction with the place, saying she can't stay here. Edward understands her feelings and plays a few bars on the piano. Vera adds that they will escape from the monotony of marriage and the paper factory eventually. As Edward continues to play, Vera is captivated by his beautiful melody, lost in the moment and gazing at him with admiration for his talent. However, the sound of Roland and Victor entering interrupts their moment. Edward keeps playing while Roland and Victor approach and listen to the music, but Roland's gaze towards Vera makes her feel self-conscious. She moves to the other side of the room. Eventually, Victor joins Edward at the piano, and they start playing a lively duet. Roland soon joins them, and they all play together in a fun and familiar routine. Vera watches them and can't help but chuckle at their united performance, feeling a sense of warmth in seeing how well they play together. In the next scene, Vera sits at a desk, surrounded by open textbooks, studying. Suddenly, there's a knock at the door. She startles, gets up, and answers it. Roland is standing there. Roland is smiling as he looks at Vera's textbooks and comments on her studying. He offers to help her with the Oxford entrance exams, explaining that it's all about technique. Vera is initially resistant, but she sees him reaching out to her beneath his smooth, confident surface. She softens and agrees to accept his help. After he leaves, Vera leans against the door, surprised by her own reaction and smiling at herself. Roland is astounded as well. Yet after a few moments of silence, he smiles and walks away. The following morning, Vera watches from the crack in the door as Edward pleads with their father to let her study at Oxford. She straightens up, conflicted. She is touched by Edward's willingness to share his allowance with her and his belief in her potential. Mr. Brittain questions what will happen if she doesn't get in and whether she needs tuition for it. Despite her father's reservations, Edward argues that Vera should at least be given a chance. Vera feels grateful but hides when her father calls her name. Mr. Brittain eventually agrees to let Vera sit the exam. Vera is overjoyed and hugs her father. He reminds her that she's only sitting it out, and they'll see how she does. He then asks Vera to play the piano, and she laughs while Edward watches with a smile. In the following scene, as they ascend a stunningly verdant hill with a gentle slope, the three men and Vera engage in lively conversation and laughter. The boys playfully tease Vera, but she responds with good-natured banter, exchanging jabs with Edward and holding her own. They sit on the lush hillside, taking in the stunning panorama of the verdant countryside as it blooms in the beauty of spring. The ambience is peaceful and unhurried. Roland comments in a jovial tone about the breathtaking view, suggesting that the world is at their feet. However, Edward's expression turns sour as he points out that they are almost back at school. Roland urges the group to savor the present moment now that they've arrived at their destination. Victor expresses his anxiety about the future, realizing that only one more term stands between him and the end of school. Although he finds it daunting to contemplate his entire life ahead, he also acknowledges that it's a wonderful prospect. Vera offers a humorous remark about avoiding being stuck in the small town of Buxton, prompting Edward to tease her about being a source of gossip for the local ladies. Vera counters with a piece of gossip she has heard about Mrs. Fraser mixing up her china sets at dinner, causing quite a stir in town. Edward dismisses the triviality of female lives. However, Vera gives Edward a playful swat, warning him not to belittle the issue. Roland joins in with a chuckle, suggesting that they have a suffragette in their midst. Vera responds, saying that she would be one if given the opportunity. Edward interjects, acknowledging that he is not the right person to talk to about this matter, and points out that Roland is a supporter of the cause. Vera assumes that Roland is joking when he claims that his mother admires suffragettes. Edward points out that Roland's mother is a novelist and supports the whole family by writing for newspapers. Roland confirms this with a smile, and Vera is surprised by the revelation. Roland suggests that Vera may have jumped to conclusions about him, but she points out that the feeling is mutual. Roland then admits that he found a poem of Vera's in the garden and took the liberty of reading it. Edward interrupts, expressing his surprise that Roland has kept his love of poetry hidden. Vera snatches the poem from Edward, feeling upset and humiliated. Roland apologizes, realizing that he misread the situation between Vera and Edward. Vera assures him that it's fine, and the group sits in an awkward silence. As they make their way back, Vera deliberately slows down to be alone for a moment while Roland approaches her delicately. Edward and Victor's off-screen laughter and conversation can be heard in the background. Roland reveals that he didn't know Vera was keeping something secret and apologizes for taking it from her. Vera accuses him of storing it to use against her. Roland denies the accusation and explains that he kept quiet about it because he was moved by it and thought it was beautiful. He admits that he was hesitant to share his thoughts with Vera because she seemed like an impossible person to talk to. Vera falls silent and starts playing with the stick she picked up. After a long moment, she opens up to Roland and admits that she wants to be a writer and dreams of earning a living from it. Roland smiles and shakes his head, reassuring her that he doesn't think she's ridiculous. Roland suggests that Vera needs some experience before pursuing a writing career, to which she agrees. He then reveals that he also wants to write and feels overshadowed by his mother. Vera asks if his mother is a good writer, and Roland confirms it, adding that she achieved her success through sheer stubbornness. He invites Vera to meet his mother, as he thinks they will get along. They both share a gentle laugh before Roland encourages Vera to pursue writing and tells her that she must write. Vera is touched by his sincerity and admits that no one has ever said that to her before. They both smile at each other. As Edward and Victor rush past with their luggage, Vera is pinned against the staircase wall. She follows them downstairs and encounters Mr. Brittain, who is dressed and ready to drive them back to school. Mr. Brittain urges them to hurry up so they don't miss the train. Meanwhile, Vera keeps looking up the stairs, hoping to see Roland. Outside, Victor and Mr. Brittain are loading the car with the suitcases and boxes. Vera expresses her reluctance for them to leave. Edward gives her a smile and a quick hug, assuring her that they will have the whole summer to spend together. Victor returns and shakes her hand, while Mrs. Brittain appears on the scene. As Victor says goodbye to Mrs. Brittain, Vera spots Roland coming down the stairs and rushes over to him. She expresses her regret that he has to leave so soon. Roland asks her if she read the poem he gave her earlier. Vera hesitantly admits that she found it a little dry and possibly derivative and couldn't find him in it. Roland is stung by her criticism but assures her that the poem is indeed his. Edward calls out to him, reminding him that they're already late. Vera watches in disappointment as Roland gives her a tight smile and hurries out to join his friends. She joins her mother at the doorway as Roland runs towards the car, which is already moving along the drive. Later, worried, Vera's voice echoes in her mind as she writes to Edward, asking him to send her news of Roland Leighton and to tell him how much she enjoyed meeting him. She admits to herself that she can be her own worst enemy and hopes that Roland will remember her fondly. In the next scene, Vera falls back onto her bed, overwhelmed with happiness, as she holds an envelope in her hands. She carefully opens it and pulls out a letter from Roland, who had taken up her challenge to write a better poem. Inside the envelope, she finds a piece of paper with a new poem written by Roland. As she reads it, she can hear his voice in her mind, and she feels a rush of warmth and affection towards him. Next, Vera, looking smart in her dress, sits in a train compartment with her chaperone, Aunt Belle. The older woman is small and round, exuding warmth but also looking flustered. The two women look out the window as the train makes its way through the countryside. In the distance, the magnificent and sun-drenched spires of Oxford come into view, radiating with promise. Vera and Aunt Belle arrive at their destination, and as they walk down Broad Street, Aunt Belle chatters away in the background. Vera takes in the sights around her, students on bicycles, engaged in lively conversations, and the stunning Radcliffe camera. It all looks wonderful to her. Vera enters Somerville College, marveling at the pristine lawns and graceful architecture. Female undergraduates pass by as Aunt Belle continues to chatter on. As they stand in the courtyard, two female dons look at Vera with confusion. One of them, Miss Lorimer, approaches Vera and asks if she is lost. Miss Lorimer looks Vera up and down, clearly surprised when Vera says she's there for an exam. Miss Lorimer directs her to the porter's lodge. Aunt Belle introduces herself, and Miss Lorimer offers a patronizing smile. As they walk away, Vera hears the other make a snide remark about the entrance exam feeling like a debutante's ball. At dinner time, there is a row of women at the table, all dressed in serious black, talking and eating heartily. Among them, Vera stands out in a brightly colored silk dress, looking glumly at her plate of gray food and only half listening to the conversation. Suddenly, one of the candidates speaks up about the Latin essay and the possibility of Virgil being the topic. Vera is startled by this and realizes she didn't know about the essay. The conversation continues without her, and she is left to her thoughts. The next morning, in a hushed exam room packed with young women, Vera sits nervously at her desk as Miss Lorimer distributes exam papers face down. When Miss Lorimer places one in front of Vera, she stares at it, feeling anxious. Miss Lorimer gives the instruction to begin, and all the students turn their papers over simultaneously. Vera's face drops as she reads the questions. Meanwhile, her fellow students start scribbling feverishly. Miss Lorimer walks down the rows and meets Vera's gaze for a split second. Vera takes a deep breath, picks up her pen, and begins her exam. After the exam, Vera feels defeated and alone, watching as the other candidates exit the room with cheerful chatter. She's the last one to leave, and her shoulders sag as tears threaten to spill over. Feeling isolated and vulnerable, she stays behind as the crowd disappears. Then she notices Miss Lorimer walking confidently through the cloisters, and without thinking, she follows her. Vera calls her out respectfully and confesses that she missed the requirement for a Latin essay. Miss Lorimer responds impatiently, pointing out that it was stated clearly in the instructions. Vera explains that she had prepared for the exam on her own and didn't have a tutor to guide her. Miss Lorimer pauses and looks at her closely, noting that Vera seemed busy writing during the exam. Vera winces and admits that she wrote the essay in German instead. Miss Lorimer is shocked and tells her that Latin and German cannot be equated and begins to walk away, and Vera accuses her of already judging her as frivolous and a provincial upstart. Miss Lorimer pauses and gives Vera an ambiguous half-smile before bidding her a good day and walking away. Vera slumps, feeling like she's blown it. Back at her home, Vera sits with her mother, Mrs. Ellinger, and several other local ladies, drinking tea and chatting. She appears restless and disinterested. In a voiceover, we hear Vera's voice expressing her disappointment. She admits that the exam was a complete failure and that she will never be able to leave Buxton now. She hasn't received a letter back from Roland Leighton, but she tries to rationalize that it might be for the best since she won't be joining them at Oxford anymore. In the following scene, Mrs. Brittain waits in the hallway, holding hats in her hands. A few moments later, Vera rushes down the stairs, looking flushed and wearing a beautiful dress. Mrs. Brittain urges her to hurry, as Edward has given strict instructions not to be late for his parade. She comments on Vera's outfit, surprised that she has dressed up so much for a school speech day. She also examines the hats and expresses doubt about their suitability for the occasion. Vera, impatient, assures her that they are fine and selects one to wear. As she tries it on in front of the mirror, letters are pushed through the letterbox. Vera quickly sifts through them, pockets one with an Oxford postmark, and hands the rest to her mother. Mrs. Brittain's curiosity gets the best of her as she asks Vera about the letter she's holding, but Vera remains tight-lipped. Mrs. Brittain insists, telling her daughter that she can't keep things hidden like this. Vera finally reveals that it's a letter from Oxford, but begs her mother not to tell her father. Mrs. Brittain is disappointed that it's not from a boy but suggests that Vera open the letter. Mr. Brittain walks in, absorbed in reading a newspaper with a worried expression, as the headline reads Archduke shot, Austria in turmoil. Mrs. Brittain tries to engage him in conversation, but he is too preoccupied with the news. Finally, Vera calls out to him, and he absent-mindedly agrees with her mother's choice of hat. As they arrive, rows of schoolboy officer cadets in gleaming uniforms march stiffly under the orders of an officer teacher. Families watch proudly from the sidelines as the parade goes on. Vera weaves her way through the crowd, trying to reach the front. She spots Edward and Victor and gives them a smile, but her eyes search for Roland. When she finally finds him, she smiles at him and makes eye contact, but he seems to be focused on something distant, and she can't seem to share in his goal. As a new group of Uppingham boys steps out onto life's stage, Vera encourages them to be strong, loyal, and brave. The headmaster stands at one end and delivers a speech from a podium. He speaks about loyalty to oneself, family, and, above all, to the country, ready to serve the glory of the empire. People are scattered across the courtyard, chit-chatting, Mr. and Mrs. Brittain among them. Edward is standing with them, dressed in his officer cadet uniform. Vera fidgets with the Oxford letter in her pocket, feeling nervous. She shows it to Edward, hoping for some reassurance. Edward notices Vera's nervousness and suggests they find a private corner to read the letter she is holding out to him. She nods in agreement and hands him the letter, admitting that she already knows what it says. Edward takes the letter from her hand and begins to read, his expression remaining neutral as Vera anxiously watches. His face soon breaks into a gentle smile as he confirms that she has been accepted. Vera's face contorts with a mixture of shock and disbelief, but as the reality of the situation sets in, she lights up with delight. Edward wraps his arms around her and lifts her up in celebration. As he sets her down, Edward mentions that she still needs to work on her Latin, prompting Vera to scan the letter and laugh. She hesitates for a moment before asking if she should tell Roland, to which Edward urges her to do so. Vera navigates through the clusters of people until she spots Roland standing with his parents and Victor. Mrs. Leighton and Mr. Leighton are engaged in conversation with Roland. Victor notices Vera and signals for her to join them. As she approaches, Roland introduces her as Edward's sister. Mrs. Leighton expresses her pleasure at meeting Vera, but when Vera looks to Roland for a reaction, his expression remains inscrutable. After receiving congratulations from Victor and a playful remark from Mrs. Leighton, Vera feels disappointed by Roland's reserved smile and assumes he is not interested in her news. She excuses herself and rushes away to tell her parents. However, Roland immediately follows her and catches up as she strides through groups of people. He calls out to her to wait. He asks her if they can talk alone, and she hesitates before he gestures ahead and pleads with her. She reluctantly agrees, and as they leave, Victor watches them with disappointment while Mrs. Brittain observes their departure. Roland and Vera walk in silence through the garden, with Roland scanning for a more private spot. He looks around and then leads her around a corner towards a crumbling Greek folly, enveloped in a mass of foaming roses. Roland breaks the silence by congratulating Vera on her acceptance to Oxford. Vera dismisses his compliment, but Roland assures her that he truly means it. Vera then blurts out that if Roland only wants to be friends, that's fine with her and that she prefers clarity. The conversation turns awkward as they both struggle to express their feelings. Vera brings up the fact that Roland's mother didn't even know she existed, but Roland explains that it's a form of self-protection. He then smiles charmingly, but quickly turns sincere as he begins to speak from the heart. Roland and Vera discuss their feelings towards each other, with Roland admitting to carrying her letter with him but struggling to express himself through words. He suggests they see each other every day and jokes about being her chaperone. They share a moment of intimacy and agree to move forward without fear. However, their moment is interrupted by the sudden appearance of Mrs. Brittain. She approaches them, disapproving of their behavior. Roland takes a step forward and respectfully asks for permission to see Vera again, but this time fully chaperoned. Despite the interruption, Vera and Roland share a smile, showing their willingness to make their newfound connection work. Vera is sitting in a train compartment, staring out at the passing scenery with a sense of excitement. She speaks to herself, mentioning her father's depression about the European situation, but her mind is focused on getting on the train to London. As she walks down the train platform, her Aunt Belle follows her, struggling to keep up. Vera spots Roland waiting for her with a pink apricot rose in his hand. She rushes over to him, and they both become tongue-tied. Roland hands her the rose, and Vera fixes it to her dress. Aunt Belle trails behind them, huffing and puffing to keep up. Despite her complaints, she seems happy for them, knowing what it's like to be in love. Roland sees a theater up ahead and pulls Vera towards it. Aunt Belle appears around the corner, sees them, and follows. As they enter, a show is taking place on stage, but the theater is almost empty. Roland guides Vera along an empty row of seats, and they sit next to each other. He drapes one arm across the back of her seat. Aunt Belle follows, squeezing along the row past Vera, then stopping. She tells Roland to move along. Reluctantly, he shifts over, and Aunt Belle sits firmly between them with a smug expression. Vera smiles, and Roland tries to reach out to her by caressing her neck gently. However, Aunt Belle notices and pushes his arm away abruptly, making them both suppress their laughter. Both Roland and Vera step outside to gaze at the paintings on the walls. Roland takes Vera's hand and leads her to a bench in a secluded corner. They sit close together. The tension between them is palpable. Vera turns her head and looks at Roland, and he looks back at her. There is a moment of hesitation, then they move towards each other and kiss passionately. They joke about being truants and getting a terrible report. Vera admits that her mother finds her exasperating and odd. Roland disagrees, saying she's just different. They share a tender moment, looking into each other's eyes, and then continue on their adventure. Vera expresses to Roland that her aunt is always keeping an eye on them, but Roland thinks they are just having a bit of harmless fun. Vera talks about her mother finding her exasperating and odd, but Roland reassures her that she's just different. As they stop walking, they realize they're alone, and Roland moves in closer, wanting to kiss her. Vera admits that she has always felt like she doesn't belong anywhere. Roland takes her by the arms and is about to kiss her when Aunt Belle suddenly appears. They both freeze as Aunt Belle scolds them for their behavior. Roland looks frustrated as Aunt Belle continues to reprimand them. Later at the train station, as they walk, Aunt Belle takes the middle spot between Roland and Vera. Suddenly, Aunt Belle complains that her feet are hurting and suggests they call it a day. She spots a newspaper stand and decides to get herself a cup of tea. Aunt Belle rushes towards the stand, where a small crowd has gathered. Vera turns to Roland with a smile and says that they will see each other soon. In the meantime, Aunt Belle reads the newspaper. The headline reads Germany ultimatum to war, and the people around her murmur anxiously. As Vera and Aunt Belle travel home, Vera gradually tunes into the conversation of a nearby passenger with her Aunt Belle, who boasts about her sons being at the front of the queue to join the war effort against Germany. Vera's expression turns troubled as she reads the newspaper. In her bedroom the next evening, Vera notices a faint purple bruise and a red mark on her upper arm where Roland had gripped her. A soft smile spreads across her face as the memory of their moment together floods her mind. She touches the marks with her fingertips, lost in thought, until Edward knocks on the door and enters the room, startling her. Edward informs Vera that he's planning to sign up for the war and has talked to their father about it. He explains that it's what they trained for as officer cadets, but their father would rather die than let him go. Edward mentions that some of the boys in town have already signed up, and he doesn't want to be left behind. Vera promises to talk to their father calmly. Edward asks Vera why she's so cheerful, but she denies having a specific reason, and she mentions that she doesn't think Roland will join the military, as he doesn't seem like the type. Edward looks at her and advises her not to get too attached to Roland. Vera asks why, but before Edward can respond, she playfully throws a cushion at him, and he leaves the room with a grin. The next scene depicts Mr. Brittain entering the hallway, his face contorted with anger, and starting to pace towards the living room. Vera interrupts her father by saying that the war will be fast and short. After Mr. Brittain hears Vera's statement, he quickly says that he knows more than she does and that the war is never fast and short. Vera takes a deep breath in an attempt to regain her composure. Vera challenges Mr. Brittain's pessimistic view of the war's duration, saying that if everyone believes it will be a long war, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. She suggests that perhaps this generation can end the war quickly if everyone does their part. Mr. Brittain looks at her with a haunted expression, and she reminds him that Edward may feel pressured to sign up if everyone around him is doing so. Vera urges Mr. Brittain to let Edward make his own decision and be a man, warning that he may resent him if he doesn't. This causes Mr. Brittain to question his own position. A few weeks later, Vera, in her nightgown, packs her belongings for Oxford. She writes a letter to Roland, asking him to meet her at Leicester Station on Thursday. As Vera's train stops at Leicester Station, she leans out of the window, searching for Roland among the crowds. She then walks down a crowded train corridor. Finally, she spots him further down the corridor, emerging from a compartment, and she hurries towards him. However, she soon notices that Roland is not carrying any luggage and asks him about it. Roland's face shows a flicker of emotion as he indicates a compartment and leads Vera inside. Once the door is shut, he tells her that there's something he needs to tell her. He hesitates for a moment before revealing the news. He's not coming to Oxford. Vera is shocked and asks if he's signed up. Roland confirms that he's joined the 4th Norfolks and will be leaving tomorrow. The weight of this news hits Vera hard, and she sinks down onto a seat. Roland sits next to her. He explains that his uncle Theo, a military man, pulled some strings to make it happen, but he did it willingly. Vera looks at him, feeling betrayed. However, Roland insists that he has to go and can't let others do his duty for him, seeing it as a chance to be involved in something significant. She sees Roland's excitement and passion for the opportunity. He tells her that he will be stationed in Norwich, which is not even active service, and that there will be months of training before anything happens. He tries to reassure her that he and Ted will likely come to Oxford with her in the new year. Vera has tears streaming down her face, and Roland is upset and confused as well. Roland leans towards her, and they share their first kiss, a long-awaited and devoted one. In the train compartment, Roland and Vera hold each other in a tight embrace, looking out the window as the beautiful spires of Oxford come into view. Vera finally breaks the silence, saying that it is strange that she is going to Oxford without Edward or him. Roland pulls her closer, his uncertainty evident in his embrace. Vera arrives at Oxford. She walks across a quad, holding books in her arms, and nearly collides with Miss Lorimer. Vera says that she must be surprised because she is here and she has no tuition. Miss Lorimer's rudeness always seems to be eccentric rather than spiteful. She compliments Vera on displaying an original mind but questions her ability to bring discipline to it. With that, Miss Lorimer walks off. The next scene, Vera reaches up to retrieve some books from a high shelf and carries them over to her desk. Vera is writing an essay, but she pauses her essay and retrieves a half-written letter to Roland, continuing to write. In her letter, she expresses her desire for him to leave the army and join her in Oxford. She informs him that Victor's been turned down because of his poor eyesight, but Edward's joining the Sherwood Foresters soon. Vera is making her way along the street when Edward, in his uniform, sees her. He smiles and crosses over. Both of them embrace each other, asking each other how they are doing. Vera emerges from a staircase entrance and is greeted by the sight of stacks of metal beds and mattresses piled up around the porter's lodge. As Vera looks around, she notices a young war veteran in a wheelchair at the college entrance. A nurse helps him as she watches them. Next, Vera reaches into her pigeonhole. With a trembling hand, she tears open the envelope she found and reads the contents. It's from Roland, and it confirms her worst fear. He is leaving for France on Thursday and wants her to confirm that she can join him. Vera looks up from the telegram, completely stunned by the news. Next, Vera stands in front of Miss Emphasis. Miss Lorimer speaks sternly about not allowing students to go to London, while Vera argues that it's not just a gallivant. Miss Lorimer emphasizes the importance of women working harder than men to demonstrate their worthiness of degrees. Vera reveals that she's going to say goodbye to someone who's going to the front and notices the photo on the side table. She takes a risk and asks if Miss Lorimer has someone already there, and Miss Lorimer answers that her brother is there. Vera asks her how she perceives the war. She says that it is as simple as men going to fight while women remain to knit. Vera asks how many pairs of socks it will take, and they share a smile. Miss Lorimer asks if Vera will be back the same day and have a chaperone, to which Vera responds with yes. Miss Lorimer nods in agreement. Vera thanks her. At the train station, Vera walks down the busy platform towards Roland, who is standing and waiting for her. Vera looks at Roland and asks how long they have. He tells her they have about an hour. Vera's face shows concern as she realizes he has received a transfer to France. She accuses him of being eager to face death, but Roland denies it. Suddenly, Vera notices that Roland is sick and has a fever. Aunt Belle arrives and comments on how handsome he looks in his uniform. They all head to a cafe at the train station. Roland and Vera sit at a table, with Aunt Belle moving around them, searching in her purse. After a moment, she takes out a bottle of aspirin and hands it to Roland. He takes them gratefully. Roland attempts to get up to fetch the tea from the counter, but Aunt Belle insists on getting it herself. Vera immediately apologizes to Roland for being harsh earlier, but Roland expresses feeling like he's let her down. Vera disagrees, and they both look at each other, feeling too choked up to speak. Aunt comes back and starts to pour the tea, mentioning how the troops are being hit by influenza. Despite her efforts to lighten the mood, a heavy silence persists. Aunt Belle looks at them and realizes the depth of their emotions. She sighs sympathetically, understanding that some things are just too profound to express in words. Roland, Vera, and Aunt Belle make their way up from the subway station. Roland points to a train that is puffing out steam and waiting for them. Aunt Belle leads them to an empty compartment, shooing away people who try to enter. Once inside, Aunt Belle closes the compartment door, leaving them alone. Roland embraces Vera, kissing her with passion and desperation. Roland and Vera cling to each other as the train whistle blows, signaling departure. As they make their way towards the door, the atmosphere becomes frantic, with couples kissing goodbye and families embracing. The crowd pushes and shoves, and Vera is suddenly thrown outside the train. She desperately tries to get back in, but the door slams shut. Roland opens the window and leans out as Vera grabs his hand. He tells her that he will write to her. They hold on tightly as the train begins to move, separating them. Later that day, Vera walks down the street towards her college. She hears a voice behind her and turns to see Victor striding towards her with concern on his face. Roland had asked him to come to her aid. Vera feels her emotions and exhaustion, and Victor gestures to a nearby bench for them to sit together. Vera expresses her uncertainty about staying in college and mentions the call for volunteers to nurse. They both smile, and Victor tries to comfort her, saying that Roland was born to make his mark on the world and won't die young. Vera's face lights up with hope, and she thanks Victor for being there. She apologizes for hurting him, but he interrupts, saying there's no need, and that he's actually met a girl named Molly who's keen on him. Vera congratulates him and puts her hand on his, squeezing it with a smile, saying that Molly is lucky to have him. Next, Vera steps out of the porter's lodge and spots a boy on a red bicycle, who rides over to her and takes out a telegram from his satchel. The boy hands it over to Vera, who reads the name on it. It's from the War Office. Vera hands it to Miss Lorimer. Miss Lorimer tears it open, reads quickly, and staggers. Vera quickly supports her arm. Later, Vera is walking to her lecture when she sees a newsstand. She purchases a paper and opens it to find a column for Fallen in Combat. She looks down the column, and it continues over the page. She is concentrating, looking for Roland's name, but she is relieved to not find it, and the rain starts to suddenly pour. Roland is seen in the following in a muddy trench, alongside other soldiers, under heavy shellfire during a downpour. Later, Vera goes to see Miss Lorimer. She stands in front of Miss Lorimer, who looks astonished at the news that Vera plans to volunteer for nursing. Miss Lorimer questions the decision, suggesting that there are many other eager young women who haven't given up their promising careers at Oxford. Vera explains that she feels the need to do something and cannot stay buried in books. Miss Lorimer tells her that the crisis needs people who can stand back and reflect, and she reminds her of the golden opportunity she has worked so hard for. Despite this, Vera's mind is made up, and she thanks Miss Lorimer before heading for the door. Miss Lorimer turns away, and Vera throws her one last look, but Miss Lorimer's back is turned, and she appears upset. In London General Hospital, Vera stands among a group of VAD nurses, dressed in a floor-length uniform, walking down a long and drafty corridor. Sister Jones, a stern career nurse, inspects the group with a critical eye. She addresses the group, reminding them that they are not angels of mercy but workers who will do whatever they are asked, no matter how dirty or dull the task may be. Sister Jones singles out Vera, inspecting her hands and making a small sneer when she sees that they are smooth, white, and spotless. She warns the group that airs and graces will not be tolerated, especially from those who have come from ivory towers. Sister Jones offers the nurses an opportunity to leave if they have any doubts, but there is silence, and no one moves. Vera remains resolute among the group, determined to make a difference in whatever way she can. Before dawn, Vera wakes up to the sound of an alarm clock in a room with other women. Sister Jones, a surgeon, and two nurses are in discussion as Vera and her fellow VADs enter the room. Sister Jones turns to face them and demands to know who sterilized the instruments. Vera responds that she did, and Sister Jones focuses her attention on her. Sister Jones asks if Vera did a good job, and Vera hesitates before answering that she thinks so. Sister Jones then reveals another tray of instruments that haven't been sterilized, and Vera realizes her mistake. Sister Jones reprimands Vera for forgetting and reminds her that lives could be at risk. Vera says nothing and takes the remarks. Under the watchful gaze of ward Sister Jones, Vera skillfully arranges the instruments in the correct order. Speaking to herself, she admits that the nurses at the hospital are aware of her background and are determined to challenge her. However, she admits that the more they push her, the more grateful she is. Next, Vera rides a crowded bus in the rain and finds a seat at the back. She looks out at the dreary street through the rain. Roland's letter recounts how he has been collecting items from a fallen soldier's pockets and bundling them in a handkerchief to be sent to someone who will see more than just a few insignificant items. Following that, Vera enters the room and finds Nurse Scott and Nurse Milton working with urgency on an unconscious man. The latter complains about the state in which the patient was sent over. Nurse Scott responds, mentioning that they are seeing more and more cases like this. Nurse Scott orders Vera to sponge down the wounded soldier, and the other nurses leave the room. Vera hesitates before starting to wash the blood and mud from his chest. The wounded soldier hoarsely says her name. Vera leans in closer, surprised. He opens his eyes wider and addresses her as sister. Vera realizes her mistake but continues to sponge him down. In her voiceover, Vera reflects that she felt a connection to Roland that day, as though they were touching. A fatigued Vera rushes down a hallway and turns a corner, where she spots Edward with his friend Geoffrey. She embraces Edward tightly, and he looks at her with concern. Edward then introduces Geoffrey to Vera. Vera seems anxious and asks Edward if he is leaving for France. Edward reassures her that he is not leaving yet, and Vera expresses her relief while apologizing to Geoffrey. She shakes his hand. Geoffrey looks like a shy soldier, making Vera joke about him being a peace-loving soldier. Edward defends Geoffrey, saying that he was about to train as a priest, which takes courage. Edward tells Vera to come with them. Vera turns to Edward and asks where they are going, to which he replies that Roland is home on leave and they should go see him. Later, they are in the Leetons' front garden with Mrs. Leeton, who is flamboyantly dressed. The family house is located dramatically above the beach. Vera finds Roland, looking worn and anxious in his dusty officer's uniform. As soon as he sees her, he tells her that he has to go back in 3 days. Vera is shocked, but she tries to reassure him and suggests that they don't think about it. However, when Edward and Victor approach, Roland's mood suddenly shifts, and he greets them with more ease. Vera watches as Edward introduces Geoffrey to Roland, feeling confused and unsure if this is what she was expecting. Vera, Edward, and Victor watch as Roland throws his army knife at an old wooden post and hits it perfectly. They cheer for him as he retrieves the knife. Roland then sits on a dune and begins to tell a story about repairing wire at night with an officer named Harrison. Victor asks if he was scared, but Roland replies that they don't think about it. He invites Harrison to stay, but the officer says it would make a man soft. Vera sarcastically remarks about how they shouldn't be soft. Edward claps Victor on the back and suggests they get some tea, leaving Vera and Roland alone. Roland starts to walk away, but Vera stops him and asks him to talk to her. He responds harshly, saying that perhaps she can't understand. The tension between them is palpable. Vera mentions sending Roland some poems, to which he responds that he doesn't think he received them. She then asks if he writes any poems himself, which Roland scoffs at. He sees Vera's expression and becomes frustrated before walking away, with Vera following closely behind. As he quickens his pace, Vera calls out to him, grabbing his arm. He shakes her off so hard that she falls, but immediately regrets it and helps her up. She tells him that he's not acting like his true self and places his hand on her cheek and waist, urging him to feel the reality of the moment. She implores him not to let war destroy the most precious part of him, to which he responds that it might already be gone. Vera promises him that it's not. Roland embraces Vera tightly, seeking comfort in her presence. They sit together in silence, listening to the gulls. Roland shares a painful story about a friend who passed away. He recognizes the dangers of getting too comfortable during leave. Vera strokes his hair and face, trying to ease his pain. She tells him they don't need to get engaged or married, but Roland suggests they should. He paints a beautiful picture of their wedding day with loved ones, champagne, and cake. Vera smiles at the thought of cake, but Roland's smile is tinged with sadness. Roland embraces Vera tightly and proposes to marry her the next time he's home. Vera tearfully accepts. Roland holds her close and vows to stay alive. The camera pans out to show the two clinging to each other and kissing. In the next scene, Vera and Roland are flying a kite on the beach, laughing and enjoying a carefree moment. Vera watches Roland with a childlike concentration on his face. As the scene ends, they lay on the grass, hugging each other. The next day, Vera is at the train station with Edward and her family. The platform is crowded with soldiers and their families. Edward hands her some papers and asks her to keep them for him. He then bids farewell to his father with a handshake and a stiff embrace. Vera hears two company commanders talking about how the presence of families makes it harder for the soldiers. As the train whistle blows, Jeffrey and Edward jump on board with a final wave. Vera and her family watch, visibly upset. Vera and her mother approach the station cafe, but Mrs. Brittain realizes her husband is further down the platform. He appears to be studying a timetable, so she asks Vera to go and tell him to hurry up. As Vera approaches her father, she notices that he is standing very still. When she reaches him, she realizes that he is trying to hold back his emotions. She places a comforting hand on his shoulder and calls him. His shoulders start to shake with small, silent sobs. Vera takes out a handkerchief and hands it to him, and he puts it over his face and starts crying. Next morning, in the hospital, nurses push trolleys piled high with laundered bed linen through the open door, held by ward Sister Jones. The mood is urgent as she urges them to move quickly. Vera, Betty, and a few other girls rush along the corridor, adjusting their uniforms hastily. Sister Jones gives them a task to add 200 extra beds by lunchtime and urges them to hurry. Vera reads a letter from Roland while on night duty in a quiet ward. She smiles as she reads that his Christmas leave has been approved and he will be home to marry her. Roland also mentions a surprise for her and that he has been posted to company headquarters, 3 miles behind the lines. He reassures her that he is safe and will be there until he leaves. Following that, Vera and other nurses move between beds of sleeping men, hanging up Christmas decorations like tinsel and some holly. The wedding day comes. Vera is fixing her hat in the lobby's large gilt mirror. Vera glances at the clock and notes that there is only half an hour left. Her mother adjusts her hat, commenting that she looks bridal. A hotel clerk approaches Vera and calls her name, informing her that there is a telephone call for her. Vera is surprised and hopes it is Roland, who she anticipates will arrive soon. She follows the clerk over to the desk. Vera reaches for the receiver, and as she lifts it to her ear, the scene slows slightly. Vera hears a sob from the other end of the line, and anxiety fills her as no one responds to her greeting. Mrs. Leighton's sobs continue to fill the receiver, the only sound in the frozen space. Mrs. Leighton's voice continues, delivering the devastating news: Roland is dead. Vera's eyes stare out into the silent void, and her eyes fill with tears as she struggles to process the news. In the next scene, Vera is seated on a couch, motionless and rigid. Mrs. Leighton is in close proximity, her eyes red and lost in grief. Claire, Roland's younger sister, and Victor are also present, all of them isolated in their mourning. Mr. Leighton stands before them, reading a letter from an officer in Roland's company. The letter states that Roland died of wounds at the Louvencourt clearing station. Vera asks what Roland was doing at the front, to which Mr. Leighton is left in a state of shock. Mrs. Leighton wonders why he was in a trench. Mr. Leighton explains that Roland was suddenly sent there for a big push, according to the accounts. Victor adds that there was nothing about it in the papers. Mr. Leighton confirms it was a false alarm and that Roland was out mending wire when he was shot by a sniper at 2 a.m. and taken straight to Louvencourt. He died a noble and painless death late in the afternoon. Vera questions the timeline, but Mrs. Leighton, visibly upset, gets up and goes over to a record collection, pulling out a gramophone record. She says that Roland loved the piece and turns away, close to tears. Claire takes Vera's hand and smiles at her through tears. Vera briefly squeezes Claire's hand, but she cannot respond to the emotion. The next day, Vera enters a bright sunroom filled with recovering soldiers. She asks about a specific patient and is directed to a young man named George, who is sitting at the far end with one arm in a sling. A nurse is assisting him to stand up. As she approaches, Vera introduces herself as Roland Leighton's fiancée. George recognizes her. The nurse informs Vera that the officer is not receiving visitors that day. Vera apologizes for bothering him and begins to ask about Roland's final moments, but George interrupts, saying there is nothing more he can say. Vera persists, mentioning that George was at the clearing station the day Roland died. The nurse disapprovingly interrupts as George begins to limp away. George offers words of comfort, saying that Roland's death was quick and painless, but Vera reveals that he actually lived for hours after being shot. However, George walks away. Vera hesitates, then decides to follow him. Vera confesses that she needs to know the truth about Roland's death, and George gestures for the nurse to leave them. He tells her that Roland's wound was low in the abdomen, and he didn't stand a chance. Roland came around for a few hours, but the pain was too great for him to say anything. Vera remains calm and asks if he suffered, and George nods in affirmation. George explains that the clearing stations were chaotic and understaffed, lacking the necessary medical supplies to care for the wounded soldiers. Morphine was in short supply, and Roland only received a dose near the end. When Vera asks if Roland said anything before he passed, George is silent. After a moment of pleading, George finally relays the message. Vera looks defeated by this and expresses her confusion. George apologizes, acknowledging that none of it makes any sense. Vera thanks him for his kindness and holds out her hand, which he takes and presses between his own. Vera then turns and walks away. In the dormitory at night, Vera writes a letter to Victor in her small room. She confirms that the officer she met confirmed Roland's colleague's account of a painless and noble death. She tells Victor to take comfort in this as he faces his own challenges. The next scene shows Vera walking up the snowy garden path when Roland's sister Claire comes running out to greet her. Claire mentions that Roland's kit has been sent back to them and then rushes back into the house. Seconds later, she walks into the living room and is met by a terrible sight. Mr. and Mrs. Leighton stand frozen in horror, looking at a heap of blood and mud-stained khaki clothes in the center of the room. Mrs. Leighton turns away, unable to bear the sight, and asks her husband to take it out. Mr. Leighton moves forward, but Vera stops him. She approaches the pile of clothes and stares at it for a moment. Vera carefully picks up each item in Roland's kit. She picks up his jacket, covered in dried viscera, and holds it up to check inside the pockets. Bracing herself against the smell, she reaches into the inside pocket and finds Roland's wallet. It reveals a photo of herself inside. Crying, she finds something else inside the wallet. She reaches in and pulls out a sheaf of papers. Vera lays them down and smooths them out. They are poems, each one headed for Vera. One of them even has dried violet flowers folded into it. Overcome with emotion, Vera gazes at the poems, tears welling up in her eyes. In the garden, Mr. Leighton digs a hole in the ground. Once the hole is deep enough, they begin to shovel Roland's kit into it, burying it with heavy hearts. In the hospital, Vera is busy arranging instruments when a nurse comes to her and tells her that there is someone asking about her. Vera walks up to a man sitting in his bed, his head completely covered in bandages except for his lower face and one eye. It's Victor. She tries to make eye contact, but his one eye stares back at her, sightless. He stirs, and she takes his hand. Vera realizes that he's blind. Victor plucks at the blanket across his lap and tries to be light, saying that it's itchy. She takes the blanket off, upset, and sits back down, trying to keep her voice steady. Vera looks at Victor with concern and asks if Molly knows about his condition. She offers to contact Molly for him. Victor responds, saying that there is no Molly and never was. Victor tries to ease the tension with a small smile, saying he couldn't have her feeling sorry for him. A little later, Vera settles into a chair next to Victor, who is outside enjoying some fresh air. Victor tells Vera that he's expecting a visit from a blind officer who will teach him about Braille. Vera comments on Victor's optimism, but he responds cynically, calling them inspirational stories for the damned. He asks her if she is still writing. Vera denies it, but Victor suggests that she has plenty of material now. Vera takes Victor's hand as he gropes for it and expresses her desire to take care of him, stating that they belong together now. She mentions Roland and how he would want her to care for Victor. Victor asks if she is proposing to him, and Vera confirms it. However, Victor gently declines, and Vera gradually accepts his decision as they sit together holding hands. At night, Vera is sound asleep in her narrow bed when there's an abrupt banging on the door. A voice outside demands Brittain's presence. Vera rushes into the hospital room where Victor is lying in bed. The nurse informs Vera that Victor had called for them about an hour ago, complaining of a loud clicking noise in his head. Vera sees that Victor has passed away. The nurse offers her condolences, saying that it was a peaceful passing, then leaves Vera alone with her thoughts. The next scene takes place in the living room. Vera sits across from her parents, looking composed but determined. She tells them that she has made up her mind to go to France to serve behind the front lines, as it's as close to her brother Edward as she can get. Mrs. Brittain becomes agitated, expressing concern about the danger on the front lines. She gets up to fetch some gifts for Vera, including jars of jam and cream and some rollers for her hair. Mr. Brittain touches Vera's hand, silently asking for her understanding. Mrs. Brittain returns with more gifts, urging Vera to take care of her skin and promising to write every day. Vera takes her mother's hand and promises to use the gifts, and Mr. Brittain looks at her with admiration. Mr. Brittain expresses to Vera how proud he is of her, and they share a smile. Next, Vera is shown sitting in a crowded army truck wearing her VAD uniform as it pulls into the Etaples military base in France on a rainy day. Through the window, she sees wounded men on stretchers being carried past, while army personnel and nurses hurry along and Red Cross vehicles rumble by. Vera gets up, takes her suitcase, and climbs out. Vera is greeted by a desolate sight of mud, rain, and a warren of makeshift wood and tin huts. Vera, her clothes soaked and muddy, follows Sister Milroy, after she encounters her, through the muddy courtyard of huts. She introduces her to the nurse, Hope. Hope shares with Vera her concerns about the soldier's condition. She steps aside, allowing Vera to enter the hut. The hut is crammed with wounded soldiers. Hope mentions that they are short on everything, including surgeons, and gestures to a door at the far end. She then tells Vera that she had to cut one patient's arm off herself the day before. Vera is horrified, but Hope casually says that this is war. Suddenly, a wounded soldier calls out for water, and Vera is startled when she realizes that the patients are Germans. Hope tells her that she numbers them herself, and it's much quicker. She tells Vera to keep an eye on the soldier who cried out, as he only has a few hours left. Vera panics and asks if she has to take care of the German soldiers, but Hope obliviously tells her that she's been in charge of her own ward before. Vera struggles to cope with the overwhelming demands of the makeshift hospital. She moves from one patient to the next, trying to do what she can with the limited resources at her disposal. Vera and Hope attend to the wounded soldiers, moving from bed to bed with cups of water to soothe them. Exhausted, Vera exits the British ward and walks along a narrow path to the German ward. She passes through the ward and emerges to see a large field filled with row upon row of wounded, dying men. While Vera is giving an injured soldier a blanket, a man tells her that one of the wounded soldiers was insisting he knew her, possibly due to delirium. Vera asks where the soldier is, and he indicates that they had to take him around the back. He mentions that the soldier said his name was Edward. Vera is at the back of the tents, where the dying men have been brought. She finally sees Edward, who looks like he's dead. Falling to her knees, she checks for a pulse and finds that he's alive. Spotting a few orderlies nearby, she calls for their help, and they come over to lift Edward. As she works to cure her brother, Vera discovers a dirt-stained letter in Edward's pocket. When Edward wakes up and sees Vera by his side, he starts to cry, but Vera soothes him. She tells him about the letter, and he requests that he read it himself. Jeffrey's letter vividly describes the horrors of war. As Edward reads the words, he feels a twinge of envy for his friend's experience. Edward tries to imagine the peaceful scene that Jeffrey has described, but despair washes over him. He longs for a moment of respite from the relentless brutality of war, just as Jeffrey had found in that golden moment. By time passing, Edward gets better and is going to get back into the fight. Vera expresses relief that he will be going to Italy, as the fighting is less intense there. She then suggests they travel to exotic places together after the war is over and asks Edward where he would like to go. Edward responds by saying he would have chosen Italy as well, and they both smile. Edward makes a sudden statement, urging Vera to return to Oxford and pursue her dreams. Vera expresses her uncertainty about the war ever ending. Edward assures her that it will and then heads to the bus. He raised his hand in farewell and gave her a cheerful smile and a nod before climbing into the bus. Vera walks with purpose towards Hope, who tells her that she has responsibilities to attend to at home. After leaving, Vera finally arrives at her house. Inside, she finds her mother lying down, reading a magazine like a convalescent. Mrs. Brittain, who appears pale and strained but not seriously ill, greets Vera with relief. However, Vera's dismay is evident on her face. Mrs. Brittain proceeds to tell her daughter about her terrible turn, how the cook has left, and how it is impossible to find essential groceries like butter, meat, and eggs. Vera thinks her mother has had a breakdown, but Mrs. Brittain clarifies that nothing has been done in the house, and everything is dreadful. Vera's expression is a mixture of understanding and exasperation. Then, Vera rolls up her sleeves and begins to beat the carpets. She then proceeds to dust and polish the furniture. Vera, her mother, and her father sit at the dining table, sipping on a bowl of thin soup. Vera suggests that it's time to find a new cook. The family is introduced to a new, chubby teenage girl. Vera instructs her about the household chores, including a basket of ironing in the doorway. The new maid informs Vera that she has to leave by 5 because she has a dance to attend. Vera looks at her sharply, surprised that such events still take place. In the next scene, Vera carries a vase of flowers up the stairs, passing Mr. Brittain, who is coming down with a newspaper. He says that the flowers are beautiful, and Vera smiles. As she puts the flowers down, she glances out of the window and sees a boy on a bike cycling towards them with a satchel slung across his body. She hurries to the front bedroom window to try and keep sight of the boy as he disappears from view, but he bobs back into view and cycles up to the front door. she hears the clang of the doorbell. She hears her father answer the door, followed by a muffled exchange. Edward passed away. Then a terrible cry comes from her father. Vera is seen from behind, with her head bowed and hands against the glass pane. Next, Vera is seen mopping the corridor floor. Shouting, peals of laughter, and running footsteps can be heard. Vera looks up to see two young nurses running towards her. They're celebrating and exclaiming that the armistice has been signed and that it's finally over. There's the sound of celebrations already kicking off in the street outside. Vera's face takes this in, but immediately she returns to her tray, like an automaton. The following scene depicts Vera, dressed in civilian clothes, being pushed by a crowd of people shouting, cheering, and waving their hands. A soldier grabs her and spins her around in celebration. But she breaks free and spots the church steps. She stumbles towards them, pushing through the crowd to get inside. She sits on the marble steps, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. Later, Vera holds a small suitcase and steps into Oxford Quad. She sits on the bed in her old room and begins unpacking. She glances at the familiar view and then at the desk by the window. On the desk, there is a pen and a pad of writing paper, open, blank, and ready. However, there is no one to write to. Vera is then shown among the students heading for the dining hall doors when she sees Miss Lorimer. Miss Lorimer welcomes her back. Vera looks to Miss Lorimer for some recognition of her experiences during her absence, but instead, Miss Lorimer awkwardly mentions the upcoming study of Chaucer, and how Vera has some catching up to do. Vera gives her a look before they continue moving on with the crowd. Then she goes to the library. She tries to concentrate on her book when a girl named Winifred suddenly interrupts her. Winifred tells Vera they are tutorial partners this term and offers to help her find books. She also mentions they both want to be writers and suggests they could look at each other's work. Vera ignores her, annoyed. Winifred persists, but Vera cuts her off and says she has a lot of work to do. Winifred accepts this graciously, and Vera tries to refocus on her book. In the next scene, Winifred is walking when she spots Vera slumped in an archway. Vera has passed out and is panting heavily. Winifred rushes over and kneels beside her, noticing the anguish on her face. She calls out to Vera, asking if she's all right. However, Vera doesn't respond and continues trembling. She calls for help and tells her that she will be okay. Later, Vera is shown hopeless, in bed, her expression blank, hopeless, as Winifred stands behind her, holding books and grapes. Winifred offers more books, but Vera remains silent and unmoving. Winifred opens the curtains, allowing sunlight to flood the room, and sits down. She asks if Vera read the last books, but sees they remain untouched on the floor. Vera turns to face her and speaks for the first time, revealing that she saved her brother's life in France, but that the war still claimed him. Winifred shares that she also volunteered in France and that they are all surrounded by ghosts. Their job now is to give them a voice. Vera is deeply affected by Winifred's words. She encourages Vera to start fresh, get dressed, and enjoy the spring. Winifred insists on helping her. Vera seems to be improving. One day, Vera is walking down the street when she hears a speaker's voice coming from a nearby hall. The male speaker is discussing the topic of war reparations and whether or not Germany should pay for the war. The audience is getting agitated and angry, with an angry mother shouting out about her sons who died in the war. George is trying to reason with the crowd, saying they need to look to the future and create a better world. Vera is unable to stay silent and pushes her way to the front to speak. She introduces herself as a nurse who served at the front during the war and then tells the audience that she once cared for a hut of German officers. The crowd falls silent as Vera continues, saying that she initially hated the Germans, but later realized they were just men like them, with families and friends waiting for them back home. She believes they need to find a way to move forward, heal the wounds of the past, and build a better future together. The crowd is stunned by Vera's words and remains silent. In the next scene, Vera sits in a train compartment, pen in hand and notebook on her lap, lost in her thoughts. Later, she walks until she arrives at a lake. As she approaches the old jetty, she hears Roland's voice speaking to her. The final scene, standing by the jetty, Vera gazes out at the peaceful water, reminiscing on memories of the past. She begins to undress, leaving only her petticoat, before walking into the water. As she swims, she recalls memories with Edward, Roland, and Victor and promises them that she will never forget about them.